The wooden pew creaked under the weight of her trembling knees, as Sarah's fingers clutched the worn rosary beads, her knuckles white against the mahogany. In the amber light, filtering through stained glass windows, her lips moved in desperate whispers, but the words weren't reaching heaven. They were breaking apart in her throat, scattered like autumn leaves in a storm she couldn't control. Behind her, the sound that had haunted her nightmares for weeks finally came to life. The deliberate, measured steps of military boots against the marble floor. Each footfall echoed through the sacred silence, like a countdown, like the ticking of a clock that was running out of time. She didn't need to turn around to know it was him. She could feel his presence pulling away from her, like warmth leaving a room when winter arrives. Her breath caught as the footsteps paused just for a heartbeat near the altar where they had once promised each other forever. The same altar where she now prayed for a miracle that felt as distant as the war that was calling him away. The hymnal in her lap remained closed, its pages heavy with songs she could no longer bear to sing. Then the footsteps resumed, moving toward the exit, toward the door that would take him to a place where her prayers couldn't follow. Sarah's eyes remained fixed on the crucifixion before her, but her heart was walking away with every step he took. What she didn't know was that this wasn't just any goodbye ... It was the one that would change everything they thought they knew about love, faith, and the promises we make in the shadow of eternity. Sarah Catherine Mitchell had been kneeling in St. Mary's Cathedral every morning for the past 3 weeks. Ever since the deployment papers arrived with their official seal and cold, impersonal language. The same pew, 3rd row from the altar on the left side, where the morning light painted her auburn hair in shades of gold and sorrow. She had chosen this spot, not for its view of the cross, but because it was where she could hear his footsteps the clearest when he came to find her. Captain James Mitchell, her husband of 7 years, her anchor in every storm life had thrown their way, had been trying to make their last days together feel normal. But normal had died the moment that Manila on Vela arrived, and they both knew it. He would leave her, his dress uniform hanging in their bedroom closet like a ghost of the man who used to come home every evening at 6:15 sharp. The silver wedding band that usually sat beside his military tags now remained on his finger, a promise he hoped would travel across oceans and return to her hand. The church held their entire love story within its walls. They had met here during a Christmas service 5 years before their wedding, when she was the choir director and he was the young soldier on leave, sitting alone in the back pew with his dress blues crisp and his eyes searching for something he couldn't name. Their first kiss happened on these very steps after midnight mass. Their wedding reception had spilled out into the parish hall, where his military brothers lifted their sabers in salute, while her grandmother's lace dress caught the light from 100 candles. Now, the same walls that had witnessed their beginning were about to witness something that felt like an ending. The deployment to the Middle East would last 18 months, 18 months that stretched ahead of them like an ocean with no visible shore. Sarah's fingers traced the wedding ring that suddenly felt too loose on her finger, as if even it knew that distance would test every promise they had made. The morning light streaming through the window of St. Catherine, the patron saint of strength, illuminated the small stack of letters tied with a blue ribbon that Sarah kept in her purse. Letters she had written to him for every week he would be gone, sealed with prayers and perfume, ready to travel to places where her voice couldn't reach. She had written the first one the night they received his orders. When the reality hit her that morning, coffee and goodnight kisses were about to become luxuries measured in months instead of hours. The past 3 weeks had dissolved into a ritual of quiet desperation that neither Sarah nor James dared to acknowledge aloud. Their mornings began before dawn, with her slipping out of bed while he pretended to sleep, both of them unwilling to face the countdown that lived in every shared glance. She would brew his coffee exactly the way he liked it. 2 sugars, a splash of cream, and leave it on the kitchen counter next to his deployment checklist. Items crossed off one by one, like days marked on a calendar they both refused to look at. Sarah had memorized the sound of his morning routine. The shower running for exactly 8 minutes, the electric razor humming against his jaw, the careful way he folded his civilian clothes and placed them in the drawer they both knew he wouldn't open for over a year. She had started taking longer in the garden, tending 2 roses that wouldn't bloom until long after he was gone, her hands working in soil while her mind worked through prayers that felt as fragile as the petals she touched. Their evenings had become archaeological expeditions through their shared life. James would pull out photo albums from their honeymoon in Ireland, his fingers pausing on pictures of them laughing on cliffs overlooking the Atlantic. Both of them now wondering if the ocean between them would feel as vast as that endless blue horizon. Sarah found herself cooking his favorite meals with an urgency that bordered on desperation. Pot roast on Tuesday, homemade apple pie on Wednesday, the chicken casserole his mother had taught her to make, as if she could somehow store up all the comfort food and love in his memory before he left. The hardest part wasn't the big conversations about staying safe and coming home. It was the small silences that had crept into their daily rhythm like shadows at dusk. The way James's hand would hover over the light switch at bedtime, as if turning off the lamp meant accepting that another day had passed. The way Sarah's laugh had become softer, more careful, as if too much joy might somehow tempt fate. They made love with a tenderness that felt like goodbye even when they whispered good morning, thereby saying things their voices couldn't bear to speak. James had taken to walking through their small house at odd hours, touching door frames and running his fingers along the kitchen counter, where they'd shared 1,000 cups of coffee and 10,000 small conversations about their future. He would stand in the doorway of the spare room they'd painted yellow for the baby they were planning to try for when he returned, the empty crib they'd bought on sale still in its box, waiting like everything else in their life had learned to wait. Sarah discovered that grief could live alongside hope in the same moment. She had started a journal addressed to him, writing entries for each day he would be gone, filling pages with the mundane details she knew he would miss. How the neighbor's cat had learned to sleep on their front porch, how the oak tree in their backyard was already changing colors, how she had learned to fix the leaky faucet in the bathroom because she couldn't bear to call a repairman and admit he wasn't there to do it. The church had become her rehearsal space for absence. Each morning she practiced being alone in the place where they had never been apart, learning the weight of solitary prayer in pews designed for 2. Father McKenna had noticed her increased attendance but said nothing, understanding that some preparations for separation require sacred space and holy silence. Their friends had tried to help with farewell dinners and see-you-soon parties, but Sarah and James found themselves clinging to quiet moments instead. Him reading while she knitted, both of them stealing glances at each other as if memorizing the way afternoon light fell across familiar faces, the sound of pages turning, the rhythm of breathing that would soon become a solo performance. James Mitchell had carried heavier loads in his 7 years of military service, but nothing had prepared him for the weight of leaving Sarah behind. The duffel bags sitting by their front door contained regulation gear, pressed uniforms, and emergency contacts, but it couldn't hold the invisible cargo that pressed against his chest every time he looked at his wife, the knowledge that love and duty were about to pull him in opposite directions, across an ocean that felt wider than any he'd crossed before. His hands had developed a tremor in the past week, not from fear of combat, but from the simple act of folding Sarah's nightgown when he helped with laundry, knowing it would be months before he touched something that had touched her skin. He'd caught himself memorizing details his training had never taught him to notice, the way she hummed off-key while washing dishes, how her hair caught light differently at various times of day, the sound of her key in the front door lock that meant home was complete again. The letters from his unit had arrived with increasing frequency, reminders of briefings and medical clearances, But James found himself reading Sarah's grocery lists with more attention than his deployment orders. Her handwriting had become something sacred, proof that she existed in a world he was about to leave behind. He'd started taking photographs of ordinary things: her coffee mug in the sink, her book left open on the nightstand, her shoes by the door, creating a visual inventory of the life he was temporarily abandoning. In his darker moments, Uswaji, Ahun 3 a.m., when sleep felt like surrender, James would stand in their bedroom doorway and watch Sarah sleep. Her breathing steady and trusting beside the empty space his body would leave behind. Military training had taught him to compartmentalize emotions, to focus on mission objectives, but no drill sergeant had prepared him for the way his heart would fracture at the sight of his wife, unconsciously reaching for his pillow in her sleep. The weight of his wedding ring had changed, becoming heavier and lighter at the same time. Heavier because it now carried the responsibility of a promise made across distance. Lighter because he feared it might somehow slip off in a moment of weakness, as if the physical symbol of their bond couldn't survive the separation their hearts were about to endure. He'd started twisting it during conversations, a nervous habit that Sarah had noticed but never mentioned, both of them learning the diplomacy of unspoken fears. James had written his own letters, 17 of them, sealed and hidden in his military, each one addressed to Sarah for different scenarios he hoped would never come to pass. Letters for her birthday, for their anniversary, for Christmas morning, for the day she might doubt whether he was coming home. The most difficult one, written in his own blood-stained handwriting after a particularly dark night, simply said, "If you're reading this, ... double quotes," and contained every love word he'd never been brave enough to say in person. His fellow soldiers spoke about deployment with the casual confidence of men who had done this before, but James found their certainty foreign. This wasn't his first tour overseas, but it was his first as a married man. His first time leaving behind someone who would measure time not in missions completed but in morning coffee shared alone, in bed sheets that would grow cold and stay that way until his return. The morning routine of checking equipment and reviewing deployment protocols had become automatic, but the new ritual of kissing Sarah goodbye each day felt like practicing for amputation. He had started leaving earlier for the base, not because his duties required it, but because watching her face in the rearview mirror as he drove away was teaching him the difference between leaving and being left behind, both hurt but in different languages that his heart was still learning to speak. This morning felt different from the moment Sarah opened her eyes. The sunlight filtering through their bedroom curtains carried a finality that made her stomach clench before her mind fully awakened to remember. Why? Today? The word sat in her chest like a stone she couldn't swallow. James's flight to the base staging area departed at 4:47 p.m. She had memorized the time the way other people memorize prayers, and it had become both. James had been awake since 4 a.m. She could tell by the way his side of the bed held only the faintest impression of warmth and the careful way he'd tucked the blanket around her shoulders. From the kitchen came the sounds of their last normal morning coffee brewing, the newspaper rustling, the quiet symphony of a man trying to make ordinary moments last longer than time would allow. The deployment bag sat by the front door, like a patient black dog, its zippers closed, on a life carefully folded and regulated. Next to it, Sarah had placed a small care package wrapped in brown paper homemade cookies that would probably be stale by the time he could eat them, a small bottle of her perfume, and a photograph of them dancing at their wedding, her dress swirling around his military dress, blues like a promise made in silk and satin. By 10 a.m., their house had filled with the brittle energy of countdown. Every conversation carried the weight of being potentially the last one for months. James rearranged his sock drawer twice, a nervous habit Sarah recognized from their first year of marriage when he was deployed for shorter missions. She found herself dusting furniture that wasn't dirty, polishing picture frames that already gleamed. her hands needing work while her heart worked through goodbyes too big for words. The phone rang at 11:30, his mother calling to wish him safe travels, her voice bright with the forced cheer that military families perfect over time. Sarah listened to his side of the conversation from the kitchen, hearing him promise to write, to call when he could, to come home whole. After he hung up, the silence stretched between them like a bridge. Neither wanted to cross, but both knew they must. Lunch became a performance of normalcy, sandwiches cut diagonally the way he preferred, chips arranged on plates as if presentation mattered when the world was ending at 4:47 p.m. They ate slowly, each bite a delayed tactic against time that moved forward regardless of their wishes. Sarah noticed how James kept glancing at the clock on the microwave, then forcing his eyes away, as if not looking could slow the hands that measured their remaining hours in smaller and smaller increments. At 1 p.m., Sarah announced she was going to church for final prayers. They both knew it was code for, "I need to fall apart somewhere you can't see," and James simply nodded, understanding that some grief requires sacred space and solitude. He kissed her forehead with the tenderness of a man trying to memorize the taste of home, and she felt the slight tremor in his lips that he thought he was hiding. St. Mary's Cathedral was empty except for Mrs. Rodriguez, who lit candles every Tuesday for her son stationed in Germany, and Father McKenna, who pretended not to see Sarah's tears as she genuflected and took her usual spot in the third pew. The church felt like a sanctuary from time itself, its stone walls holding centuries of prayers from wives, mothers, and lovers who had learned that faith and goodbye often arrive holding hands. Sarah knelt and tried to pray, but the words kept dissolving into fragments. Keep him safe. Bring him home. Let this not be... please. Her rosary beads had become worry stones, smooth from weeks of anxious handling. The stained glass windows cast colored light across her hands, red for love, blue for sorrow, gold for hope, painting her prayers in the colors of every emotion she couldn't untangle. At 3:15 p.m., she heard footsteps on the marble floor behind her, military boots, measured and deliberate, but moving slower than regulation required. She didn't need to turn around to know James had come to find her, just as she'd known he would. This was their place, their beginning, and somehow it felt right that it should witness this moment that felt like an ending. The footsteps paused at the center aisle, and Sarah could feel him standing there, his presence as familiar as her own heartbeat. She could sense him removing his military cap, his head bowing in respect for the sacred space, and possibly in preparation for the sacred act of letting go. The church held its breath around them, the afternoon light shifting through ancient glass, casting shadows that danced like time itself, beautiful, fleeting, and impossible to hold on to. When the footsteps began moving again, heading toward the altar and then toward the exit, Sarah's prayer finally found its words. Let this not be goodbye. Let this be until we meet again. But even prayers, she was learning, sometimes have to travel across oceans to find their answers. The footsteps stopped in the cathedral's sacred silence. The sudden absence of sound felt louder than any bell that had ever rung in St. Mary's towers. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she sensed James standing motionless behind her, his military discipline warring with something deeper, more primal, the gravitational pull of love that made leaving feel like tearing away pieces of his own soul. She could hear him breathing, each inhale measured and controlled, each exhale carrying the weight of words he couldn't speak. The rosary beads in her hands had gone still, as if even they understood that this moment existed outside of time, in a space where prayers and promises and the physics of heartbreak created their own laws of motion and rest. Sarah. Her name escaped his lips like a prayer he'd been holding back, soft enough that it barely disturbed the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. but loud enough to shatter every carefully constructed wall she'd built around her composure over the past 3 weeks. She closed her eyes tighter, knowing that if she turned around, if she saw his face, wearing the expression she'd been dreading, the look of a man saying goodbye to everything that made him whole, she would break apart completely. And broken wives don't help soldiers leave. Broken wives make heroes doubt their duty. But James was unraveling behind her, his breathing becoming less controlled, more human. "I can't," he whispered, his voice cracking on words that military training had never taught him how to say. "I can't walk away from you like this. Not here. Not in the place where we promised forever." The cathedral seemed to lean in around them, centuries of stone and prayer creating a sanctuary where time moved differently, where 18 months could feel like eternity and eternity could feel like 80. The light from St. Catherine's window shifted, casting blues and golds across the marble floor between them, a colored bridge made of nothing but illuminated dust and divine presence. Sarah's shoulders began to shake, not with tears, but with the effort of keeping herself from turning around, from running to him, from begging him not to go to a place where her love couldn't protect him. Her knuckles had gone white around the rosary, the small silver crucifix cutting into her palm with its sharp edges, a tiny stigmata of goodbye. "Look at me!" His voice was closer now, moved by steps she hadn't heard him take. "Please, Sarah, look at me." When she finally turned, the sight of him nearly brought her to her knees. Captain James Mitchell stood in the center aisle wearing his dress, uniform, every button and ribbon in perfect regulation order. But his face wore an expression that no military manual had ever described. His eyes were bright with unshed tears that caught the stained glass light like prisms, fracturing sorrow into all the colors of love and duty and sacrifice. In his hands, he held something she hadn't expected, her grandmother's pearl necklace, the one she'd worn on their wedding day, the one that had been passed down through 4 generations of women who had loved men in uniform, women who had learned that some battles are fought not with weapons, but with the quiet courage of waiting. "Your grandmother wore this while she waited for your grandfather to come home from World War II, James said, his voice steady but soft, trained to project authority but choosing tenderness instead. "Your mother wore it during Vietnam, and you... ... His voice broke slightly. "You wore it when you married a soldier, knowing this day would come." Sarah stood slowly, her legs unsteady, her heart hammering against her ribs like something caged and desperate. The pearls in his hands caught the light, each one smooth and luminous, polished by decades of nervous fingers, blessed by generations of prayers whispered in the darkness of separation. "I want you to wear it while I'm gone," he continued, stepping closer until she could smell his aftershave mixing with the lingering incense from morning mass. "I want you to remember that you come from a long line of women who knew how to love soldiers, how to be strong enough to let them go and brave enough to believe they'll come home." When he reached out to fasten the necklace around her throat, his fingers brushed the base of her neck with a gentleness that contradicted the strength she could feel trembling in his hands. The pearls settled against her collarbone like a rosary made of moonlight, each one a prayer, each one a promise that some things are strong enough to survive distance. "I need you to know," he whispered, his forehead touching hers, their breath mingling in the space between goodbye and see you later, "that every sunrise I see over there will be nothing compared to the light in your eyes right now. Every sunset will be practice for coming home to you." Sarah's tears finally came then, not the violent sobs she'd feared, but something quieter, more sacred, the kind of crying that waters the seeds of faith, that blesses the ground where love plants its deepest roots. She reached up and touched his face, memorizing the rough texture of his jaw, the warmth of skin that would soon be too far away for her fingertips to find. "Come home to me," she whispered, the words both command and supplication, both prayer and promise. "Come home to me, James Mitchell." "Always," he replied, sealing the vow with a kiss that tasted like salt and eternity, like communion, wine, and wedding cake, like every sacred thing that makes ordinary people capable of extraordinary love. When they finally stepped apart, the cathedral light had shifted again, casting longer shadows that reached toward the exit, toward duty, toward the airplane that would carry him across oceans. But in that moment, surrounded by stone saint and colored glass prayers, they had created something that distance couldn't diminish, a love blessed by holy ground and witnessed by angels carved in marble. As James walked toward the cathedral doors, each step echoing like a heartbeat in the vast sacred space, Sarah remained kneeling in the third pew, her fingers tracing the pearls at her throat. The weight of them felt different now, not like jewelry, but like armor forged from generations of love, blessed by women who had mastered the art of loving across impossible distances. The heavy wooden doors closed with a whisper rather than a bang, and suddenly Sarah understood something that no amount of preparation could have taught her. Goodbye isn't a moment. It's a choice you make every day. It's choosing to believe in tomorrow when today feels unbearable. It's choosing to see sunrise as promise rather than punishment. It's choosing to wear pearls passed down from women who knew that some loves are worth the wait. She could hear the distant sound of his car starting, the engine that would carry him to the base, to the airplane, to a world where her voice couldn't reach but her prayers could follow. And for the first time in 3 weeks, Sarah didn't feel the urge to run after him, to beg him to stay, to make him choose between duty and devotion. Instead, she felt the strange, quiet strength that comes from understanding that true love doesn't ask people to be smaller than their calling. It asks us to be brave enough to love them in their fullness, even when that fullness takes them away. The afternoon light continued its ancient dance through stained glass, painting the cathedral in shifting patterns of blue and gold, red and green colors that reminded Sarah of the army flag, of her wedding dress, of the sunrise they'd watched together on their honeymoon, of the Christmas tree they'd decorated just last month with ornaments that would wait patiently in storage until his return. Father McKenna appeared beside her pew, his presence gentle and "The hardest prayers," he said quietly, "are the ones we pray with our lives instead of our lips. Your love for him, your choice to let him serve, that's a prayer that reaches heaven before words ever could." Sarah nodded, understanding flooding through her like grace. She had been trying to pray for strength to survive his absence. But what she really needed was wisdom to see that his leaving wasn't an ending. It was an expansion. Their love would now have to learn new geography, stretching across time zones and continents. But geography had never been strong enough to contain what they'd built together in 7 years of shared mornings and whispered promises. Standing slowly, Sarah walked to the prayer candles at the side altar, where dozens of small flames flickered like stars brought down to earth. She lit one for James's safe return, but then she lit another, this one for herself, for the woman she was about to become over the next 18 months, the woman who would learn to sleep diagonally across the bed, who would master the art of video calls across impossible time differences, who would discover that solitude and loneliness are entirely different countries, and only one of them is a choice. As she stepped out into the September afternoon, the pearls at her throat caught the sunlight, each one gleaming like a small moon, like a rosary bead made of ocean and time, and the accumulated prayers of women who had loved soldiers throughout history. She could feel them against her skin, her grandmother's courage, her mother's resilience, her own growing understanding that military wives aren't just women who wait. They're women who transform waiting into an act of service, who turn separation into a form of strength that the world needs to witness. The drive home took her past the places that held their story. The diner where he'd proposed over coffee and apple pie, the park where they'd had their first fight and their first make-up kiss. The little house with yellow paint and white shutters, where his absence would teach her the difference between empty and both were states of being, but only one carried hope in its suitcase. That evening, as Sarah sat at their kitchen table writing the first letter she would send to his overseas address, she realized that love stories aren't just about falling in love. They're about learning to love across every landscape life creates, whether measured in miles or months or moments that feel like eternity. Some love stories happen in the same room. Theirs would happen across continents, connected by letters and prayers and the patient faith that some promises are strong enough to survive any distance. Outside her window, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and Sarah smiled for the first time in weeks. Somewhere, on an airplane crossing the Atlantic, James was looking at those same stars, wearing the same wedding ring, carrying the same promise. Distance, she was learning, is just geography. Love is navigation, and they had learned to read each other's hearts, like maps drawn in a language only they understood. If this story has touched your heart, if you know the weight of loving someone whose duty calls them to distant places, please subscribe and share, because these stories of ordinary people making extraordinary sacrifices, of love that refuses to be limited by geography or time, remind us that the strongest forces in the universe aren't measured in weapons or warfare, but in the quiet courage of hearts that choose to love across any distance, through any darkness, until the morning when all separations end and every promise finds its way home.